Hello. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Sarah Brady, and I'm the Interim CEO for the California Council on Science and Technology. I'd like to open our briefing today by acknowledging that many of us are calling in from different locations in what we now call the state of California, which is home to many indigenous communities that have stewarded this land since time immemorial. Today, I'll introduce CCST, our disaster resilience initiative, and then hand it over to our moderator. The California Council on Science and Technology is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization established over 35 years ago at the request of the legislature. CCST was created to bring science and technology advice from the wealth of outstanding academic and research institutions in our state directly to policymakers. California is very lucky to have such an incredible network of expertise, and our job at CCST is to help amplify and translate the expertise in this network into actionable advice for policymakers. We do this through a number of mechanisms, including expert briefings like the one you are attending today. We host workshops, we write peer-reviewed reports, and we run the CCST Science Fellows Program, where we place PhD scientists and engineers for a year of government service and leadership training in the executive branch and the legislature. As part of our mission, CCST is advancing work related to our disaster resilience initiative to help the state better prepare for and respond to ongoing, complex, and intersecting disasters that affect public health, our economy, and our environment. These include climate change, power outages, the COVID-19 pandemic, and cybersecurity threats against critical infrastructure, all of which are radically disrupting the ways in which Californians live and work. These disruptions, while often destructive and painful, can provide us opportunities to redesign our systems to be more resilient and sustainable. Through our disaster resilience initiative, we seek to deliver science and technology advice to reduce harm and improve the lives of all Californians. Today, we are focusing our discussion on how California and the United States more broadly can build a more sustainable and resilient lithium battery supply chain. Please note that this is the first of two expert briefings CCST plans to host on the topic of lithium. The second is scheduled for December 15th and will dive into greater detail about extracting lithium from geothermal brine. So please mark your calendars. I'd now like to introduce our moderator, Alissa Howlett. Alissa is the Regional Business Development Specialist, serving as the Inland Empire and Southern Border Regions leader for job growth, economic development, and business assistance efforts at the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development. In this role, Alissa engages with communities and businesses alike to drive economic development, including business attraction, retention, and expansion to support job creation. Thank you, Alissa.
Thanks, Sarah. And for those of you in the audience who aren't as familiar with GO-Biz, check out our website to learn about GO-Biz and how we support businesses, job growth, and local government across the state. Now, on to our subject for today's briefing. The demand for lithium, a naturally occurring metal used in most rechargeable batteries, including those found in our electric vehicles, is growing at an exponential pace. Right now, less than 1% of the world's lithium is mined in the United States. Australia and Chile together produce more than 75% of the world's lithium supplies. China controls more than half of the world's lithium refining and battery manufacturing capacity. The degree to which our clean energy technologies like electric vehicles and grid-scale battery storage rely on foreign imports poses a threat to our national and economic security. We are joined today by 4 experts who are examining the challenges and opportunities of building a domestic lithium supply chain that is more sustainable and resilient. So I would like to invite each of our panelists to give a brief introduction of themselves and their expertise. Chris Benner, PhD, Professor, UC Santa Cruz.
Thanks, Melissa, and thanks for everyone for joining us today. So I'm Chris Benner. My background is in city and regional planning. Part of that's looking at economic geography and regional economic development, particular interest in technological change and the future of work. My interest in lithium and Imperial County comes from three studies that I've been involved in and currently involved in. One is in collaboration with a group called Alianza Coachella Valley, which is in the eastern Coachella Valley, which is really trying to develop inclusive economic development strategies for the entire region, recognizing that many of the conditions in Imperial County and eastern Coachella Valley are quite similar. I'm also working on a study in collaboration with New Energy Nexus, looking at workforce opportunities and issues along the lithium battery and electric vehicle supply chain. And precisely the question that we're trying to address today is what are the potential of landing more of those jobs or building more of those jobs in California and the broader region, and hopefully as much as possible in Imperial County and close to the lithium itself. I'm also working a little bit longer term on a book called Driving Green Justice, which is rooted in both a local analysis of Imperial County, but a global analysis of the transition to electric vehicles and what are the justice issues around both economic and environmental justice we need to be thinking about as part of that. So today I hope to be able to share really two things. One is how do we help ensure that jobs that are in the lithium extraction end of the industry in Imperial County are good jobs, have good community benefits, and are really not distorting a local economy just for extraction, but really helping to build infrastructure in a way that can help diversify the economy overall in Imperial County. And then the second point is, as I said, is how can we potentially maximize the number of jobs in the supply chain that we can attract and build in California itself. So it's a real pleasure to be with you, and thank you, Melissa, for helping to moderate.
Thank you, Chris. Now I'd like to introduce Alissa Kendall, PhD, Professor, UC Davis.
Hi, thank you, Melissa, and it's a real pleasure to share the virtual stage with these panelists. Chris, I look forward to reading your book when you finish it up. I'm a professor of civil and environmental engineering, and I chair our energy systems graduate program here at UC Davis. I come from a field called industrial ecology, and that informs the way I think about problems. And my work on lithium and more broadly lithium ion batteries and their use in EVs researches the resource flows and life cycle impacts required to meet different electrification targets. And the approach we take examines battery demand, battery supply, and then everything that follows, including the conditions and opportunities for managing retired EV batteries, including repurposing and recycling. The kind of research we do produces quantitative information on things like the potential for battery material circularity, the life cycle environmental impacts of a single vehicle or sort of a whole sector, and then also the resource requirements for meeting our decarbonization targets. And in some cases, we're also able to identify some risks to host communities and ecosystems. But the ultimate outcome that we're really trying to do is assess different policy and technology approaches for achieving the most benefit with the least harm, and largely focused on harm and benefit related to the environment. Specific projects that we work on range from developing supply and demand models that are highly resolved geographically across the world for EVs and batteries, and then the supply sites where we get the minerals that we need, to facilitating the state of California's AB 2832 advisory group on battery recycling. So I look forward to sharing some of the insights that we've gained on this research, and hopefully can answer questions related to things like circularity, battery recycling, and so forth.
Thank you, Alissa. And now I would like to introduce John McMillan, Assistant Vice President of Economic Development, San Diego State University.
Thanks so much. Hi, everybody, and thanks, Chris and Alissa and Venkat. I really appreciate you all being here. I look forward to talking with you all. So for just context, I'm the Assistant Vice President of Economic Development at San Diego State, and my work really sits at kind of the intersection of workforce and community and research and innovation. So just kind of what those components mean to me and my work. In the workforce sphere, SDSU is the fiscal agent and regional convener for the California Jobs First initiative here on the southern border, and I serve as the PI on that. SDSU has campuses in both San Diego and Imperial County, so it's really nice to feel like we can provide services to those communities where our staff, students, and stakeholders kind of live and work. Speaking a little bit more into the community piece, I'm leading another effort funded by the Department of Energy, their Solar Energy Technology Office, and that is really looking at the impact of public safety power shutoffs or really any type of power loss on disinvested communities, and understanding how resilience can be improved in those communities with things like more advanced batteries, larger deployments of batteries, solar microgrids, you name it. That project is again case study focused, and so we're really trying to highlight the experiences of our California native tribes, our medical baseline customers, or those individuals that are on durable medical equipment, resiliency centers, et cetera. The last piece is kind of this research and innovation piece, and so in 2016, in collaboration with Clean Tech San Diego, we helped stand up the California Energy Commission funded Solar and Southern California Energy Innovation Network, which is a clean tech business accelerator. Nearly 60 companies have participated in the program, including Controlled Thermal Resources, which is one of the extractors at the Salton Sea known geothermal resource area. So we've been engaging with them since 2019 and the other groups since then, whether that's myself or SDSU Imperial Valley. And then just lastly, I'm also a co-PI on the Lithium Valley focused tech hub with our colleagues at Imperial County and UC Riverside. So I very much look forward to the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And now I would like to introduce our final panelist, Venkat Srinivasan, PhD, Director of Collaborative Center for Energy Storage Science at Argonne National Laboratory.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and thank you all for the opportunity to participate. Unlike the other panelists, I'm not in California. I'm actually in Illinois, but I lived in California for many years, and it's always had a great, warm place in my heart. Quick introduction. I've been working on batteries for 25 years. Much of that work is sort of thinking about what the next generation of battery technology is going to be to decarbonize the transportation and the grid sector. My employer, Argonne National Lab, is a Department of Energy lab. It is the largest R&D lab in the United States when it comes to battery research, maybe even in the world. At Argonne, we look at everything from next generation lithium batteries to beyond lithium batteries, and even batteries that are before lithium batteries, things like lead acid batteries and zinc-based batteries. And we do this full spectrum of studies, a lot of work on discovery of new materials, but also on scaling and manufacturing. A growing effort for us is trying to understand how best to extract critical battery minerals, lithium, cobalt, nickel, but also on battery recycling. We are very interested in all of these topics. At Argonne, my role is to coordinate all the energy storage activities. So I think deeply about every aspect of the battery supply chain. Argonne is also leading a newish public-private partnership called LiBridge. Li is for lithium and bridge is for bridging this supply chain gap that I think all of us are coming to recognize is going to be very important for the decarbonization goals of the country. Lithium is going to be very important. It's important right now. It'll probably be important for decarbonization for decades to come. That is just the reality. Because of that, LiBridge has been thinking deeply about what is it going to take when it comes to technology, policy, and market barriers so that we can have a robust US-based battery ecosystem. We've brought together more than 40 companies to have convenings to really have those discussions. Lithium Valley was actually front and center in many of those conversations. Chris Benner mentioned New Energy Nexus. New Energy Nexus is one of the primary leaders in LiBridge. In addition to that, Berkshire Hathaway Energy was also one of the convening companies that came and contributed towards the Lithium Valley effort and the work that has been going on in the valley in terms of extracting lithium. In February of this year, we put out a document outlining 26 recommendations on what we think the United States needs to do to build a thriving US battery industry. You can easily find the report, do a Google search for LiBridge report on Argonne, and I suspect you'll get that in the first couple of minutes. Thank you so much. I'll stop with that and hand it back to you, Melissa.
Thank you. Now I would like to take this time to invite our attendees to please use the Q&A feature to submit your questions to our panel along with your name and affiliation. So we have our first question. I'll ask, lithium is just one component of batteries. What other critical minerals are necessary and how challenging is it to import them? Alissa?
Thanks, Melissa. Yeah, so in the US, our primary battery chemistries require lithium along with nickel, cobalt, and manganese. But we're seeing a transition to also new chemistries which are lithium iron phosphates, so requiring phosphate as well. We don't really import those ores or those minerals directly to the US. We typically import battery parts or entire batteries. And so the restrictions on our being able to access them is really about accessing those products.
Thank you, Alissa. We have a question from Brian Cook from the California State Senate. What is the recyclability of lithium in batteries from a technological and market standpoint? Direct this to Venkat.
Yeah, thank you so much. So yeah, lithium recycling and recycling of all parts of lithium battery are going to be very important, right? Turns out that cobalt and nickel are cost effective to recycle today and has been for a long time. Lithium recycling, meaning recycling lithium metal itself, was cost effective last year when the price of lithium was high. It is not cost effective today because the price of lithium has come down. And you can sort of see the problem there. The fluctuations in the price of the metal can have a huge impact on whether recyclability makes sense or if it makes more sense economically for us to pull it from the ground. As we move to chemistries that don't have cobalt and nickel, Alissa brought up lithium iron phosphate, it starts to make less economic sense because there is no cobalt, there is no nickel. Iron is not that exciting to recycle because it's not cost effective. So we really ought to think about cost-effective ways to recycling every component in the battery, not just nickel and cobalt and copper, but also lithium, but also the other components that we're sort of not touching today. So some of the work that's been going on in the community is to try to think about new ways of recycling that can enable that to happen. But till that comes into play, this whole dynamic of pricing, which is pretty, sort of has been going up and down in the last few years, is going to play its role, I think, in terms of what is and is not possible from an economics perspective when it comes to recycling. I guess we can always try to have mandates or some sort of a policy. Europe is trying to think about that. Whether that happens in the US is a question that I think is open for debate, but that could be one way to spur it.
Thank you, Venkat. We have a question. How can the US effectively incentivize the onshoring of the lithium supply chain? And what barriers are currently in place that prevent this? What can California do specifically? John, why don't you take this one?
Sure. Thanks so much, Melissa. I think, what we are seeing in this space is that China controls just such a massive amount of the refining capacity. So this global market that goes from Australia or South America to China for refinement, the processing happens there because of sort of inhumane treatment of people and the planet that are happening in some of these areas. And so part of, I think, the onshoring challenge is bringing the right organizations together early enough in the process that you can impact the supply chain while still being ethical and responsible to the environment and developing these new ecosystems in ways that don't have the same impact. I mean, certainly there would be cost implications of doing that because it costs more when you have environmental and social requirements built in. We're seeing the DoD do this pretty effectively in terms of how are they bringing more of their battery manufacturing and working with suppliers here now. But there's also the price point that the DoD is willing to pay more for those batteries, right? So to shore up that supply chain, I think one of the biggest things California can do, and what we've worked with DTSC in the past, I really think helping understand the permitting requirements so that a 2-year project doesn't seem like such a barrier. But it needs to be done. But how can we work together as opposed to being responsive to the feedback that we're getting, so that way we can sort of streamline the onshoring process.
I wonder if I could piggyback on that too. And yeah, great points, John. And the thing that I would point out too is that China controls not just the refining of the materials at the moment, but also the cathodes and anodes themselves. Something like 75% of cathodes, 80% of anodes, the other electrode in a battery, and a very high portion of battery production as well. I mean, China has been the largest market for electric vehicles for a number of years ahead of the US and Europe. The Inflation Reduction Act has had a huge impact on accelerating, at least announced and actually implementing new battery production facilities in the US. And so it's very clear that providing some of those incentives can help shift it. It's going to take a while to catch up to I think the huge lead that China has at the moment. And we have to work in cooperation, I think, with China and be, accepting of trade relationships with China for quite a while. And so I get a little worried about some of the anti-Chinese sentiment that sometimes you hear in these conversations, that while we're building up our own domestic industry, we're going to be dependent on China for some time as well. But the other issue that I would raise is in the incentives that are in the Inflation Reduction Act, there are no requirements about quality of labor. There are some project labor agreements requirements for the construction end of industries like this, but not for the operations of them. And part of what we're seeing is California has been, the leader in the electric vehicle industry. And if we look at the whole supply chain, something like 19% of all current existing jobs are in California. But of the newly announced facilities coming in, only about 2% of the announced jobs are announced in California. And California has some of the highest labor protections and highest wages of any state in the country. Most of these new facilities are going into places like Tennessee, Kentucky, Georgia, Alabama, and great economic development opportunities for them. But as the recent strike by the United Auto Workers points out, most of these facilities are non-unionized. They're paying substantially lower wages than in the unionized sector of the industry. And there aren't labor protections and policies in these states. And so I think it's a really important issue we need to be thinking about.
Go ahead, Venkat.
Sorry, I apologize. I was going to, Chris brought up the IRA, which is very important, but I also wanted to kind of quickly sort of give a shout out to the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, BIL, which in some sense is, the way I think about it is, IRA is going to incentivize today's production methods, right? It's going to be, let's take stuff that we know we can do at scale, bring that to the United States, and make those batteries with the upstream from the battery cell itself. I think about BIL as a way to sort of think about what is next, and how are we going to do the next generation chemistries and new ways of extraction that could hold the key to making things more energy efficient or using less water, but also something that can help us decarbonize. So smaller projects, but I think could be very important as we think about the next 20 years. Maybe to the point Chris made, right? All of us have watched, I think, some states really taking advantage of all the manufacturing itself. Not to speak for what could happen in California, but you can imagine that once you start extracting lithium, typically there is, I think, incentives for people to be closely located with the supply chain to minimize costs. So that I think there is probably opportunities for kind of building up things in the Southern California region because of the lithium extraction there.
John, did you want to add to that as well?
Yeah, I just had two quick points. And Venkat sort of touched on it, building an ecosystem, right, where you have CAM, PCAM, battery manufacturers. State Volt has announced their intention to come into Imperial County. Once you start getting that kind of network effect and you can co-locate industries and businesses, it's much easier to become successful, right? So you need to bring all of the pieces to one region. So that's very helpful. What can California do? Because that was part of that question. The challenge right now is that the two largest lithium-ion battery recyclers are in Nevada and Arizona, just outside of the California border. We have, I believe, the largest number of batteries scheduled to come offline in the next few years to go into the recycling ecosystem. But as Venkat said, there was challenges there. If we're looking at what about batteries sourced in California? California used to give out a $2,500 incentive check to EV buyers. It could almost mirror what was being done at the federal level, at the state level, to let consumer demand drive business development here also.
Thank you, John. Matthew Hayes at Chapman University has a question that flows really well with this conversation. How is the industry actively thinking about ways to effectively streamline the transportation of refined lithium from the Salton Sea and other refineries in California to the next destination in the value chain? Who would like to take that one?
Well, I can start on it, but I'm sure John has things to say about it too. So there's a whole plan going on in Imperial County right now that is trying to put together a programmatic EIR and a site-specific plan for where the lithium is planned to be brought out of the geothermal facilities. part of that is looking at transportation infrastructure. It's very close to a rail line that connects to the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles, and then all the way to New Orleans. So you could potentially connect on those rail lines. There would also have to be major road infrastructure to come out to the roads, the highways. Highway 8 is probably the most likely one to the south. And I think it raises an important issue in that infrastructure is needed in connection to move the lithium. And a lot of the local residents in Nyland and Calipatria and others are concerned that there will be these fancy roads coming out to extract lithium while neglecting the very major infrastructure needs that are in those local communities and local cities. And that's a little bit of what I alluded to in my introduction of, we want to make sure that this is helping to build infrastructure and economic diversity in the region as a whole, while we're paying attention to building that important infrastructure of transportation for the lithium getting out, and then of course trying to build other value-added manufacturing in the region as well.
Thank you, Chris.
John, I'm sure I missed something. You're
no,
close to that as well.
It was great. I think from our perspective, if we want to think about public health and the impact of potentially hundreds of trucks of going on these roads that are already stressed. If you go up to the Salton Sea in that area, it's unpaved roads. Typically there's bridges that are wood. Like you just can't support that infrastructure. The infrastructure is already stressed. Adding additional features like this would crumble the infrastructure, but also putting things on a rail spur and having it leave Imperial County is probably the least productive thing that we can do. We're trying to generate new ecosystems in Imperial County. So when we think about what sort of infrastructure is needed, I think Chris was exactly right, is that we have to be aware of the challenges today, but also aware that we don't put additional burden, right? I mean, idling trucks are already causing an issue in Imperial County from the port of entry in Calexico. And so how do we ensure that we're not creating additional burden by moving material around at the north end of Imperial County?
Thank you. Victoria Plume from Cal Recycle asks a question. How do the circular economy and extended producer responsibility policy frameworks apply to creating a sustainable lithium supply chain and green collar jobs? Alissa, would you like to take that one?
Sure. I can definitely speak not to the jobs, but to the rest of it. So, so in terms of what circularity can deliver in terms of providing a resource for battery manufacturing, if we were to do the best in class, best technology available recycling of our batteries, of our electric vehicle batteries, once they retire, we could meet somewhere between 50 or 60% of our internal demand for battery materials, maybe even by between 2040 and 2050, which may seem far away, but cars last a long time. So we sell one today, it doesn't retire till around 2040. In fact, the average lifetime is about 15 years. So that's a big chunk of material that we don't need to dig out of the ground if we recover the materials. Venkat alluded to something really important, which is even when recycling does occur right now, we don't necessarily even recover lithium, for example, because of the economics. So we do need to have probably policy in place so that we're not sort of just waiting for the economy to tell us what should be recovered and what shouldn't. And there are lots of policy mechanisms out there that we could use or combine and use. One of them is extended producer responsibility. That's part of the solution. It basically says we're going to recover, we're going to make the seller of this vehicle responsible for collecting the battery at end of life and making sure that it's being managed properly. That management could be, providing it to or selling it to a repurposer who would then be responsible for ultimate recycling, or making sure that the battery is recycled properly at the end of life. So one of the key issues with making recycling happen is determining who's responsible. And right now we don't have there's no stakeholder in the supply chain or the consumer. None of us are responsible for seeing recycling happen. So we probably need that to be in place if we're going to get high rates of recycling. The second part to the answer there is once it gets recycled, you have to have some kind of standards for recovery, meaning that you can't have a recycling plant that just decides to leave lithium out of the recovery process, and as an example, if you're going to achieve high rates of circularity. And again, this probably needs a policy intervention. This might be something like a recycled content standard, which would basically raise the market value of recovered or recycled material above mined material, or some kind of quality standard for the facilities that are actually recovering materials from the batteries, so the recycling plants themselves. So extended producer responsibility, really important to making sure that we actually achieve circularity. In addition to that, we need sort of, we kind of need a whole set of policies thinking about where along the end of life management process we might lose material, and then thinking about strategies to recover.
If I could piggyback on that too, from the economic perspective, and I think it was John who mentioned something about the potential consumer interest in the environmental dimensions of this. The lithium in the Salton Sea region, from an environmental perspective, is a lot better than alternative sources of lithium that come from hard rock mining, predominantly in Australia, but a little bit in China, or the large scale evaporation ponds in Chile and Argentina, which have tremendous water use and large land use. So it's a very environmentally friendly source of lithium. And so if you have that, ability to trace the source of lithium all the way through the batteries and electric vehicles, companies can use that as I think a marketing tool to help, buy a clean battery, because we're understanding the full circular life cycle of it. But I think it points to another point about the importance of collaborating, as challenging as it might seem, across state boundaries, right, with Nevada and Arizona, because one of the country's leading recycling companies, Redwood Materials, is in Nevada. Cerba Solutions and others are in Arizona, and we have some resources in California as well. But we really have sort of a Western full ecosystem of the full life cycle of lithium batteries and electric vehicles that I think we can invest in.
Thank you, Alissa and Chris. We have another question. Michael McKeeben at UC Riverside asks the question: development of a Lithium Valley workforce and supply chain is complicated by health issues associated with playa dust and related asthma issues. How can this chronic health problem be resolved in concert with workforce development?
Yes.
I was going to say John, and there you go. Good job.
I will go ahead and jump in, as we do a lot of public health work in Imperial County and the training of nurses. Just for context, I believe Imperial County has the highest rate of childhood asthma in the nation, and they have, I think, double the national average of childhood admittance to the hospital for asthma-related issues. So the asthma that's associated with, pretty toxic playa dust from, 100 years of ag runoff into the Salton Sea after it was created in 1918. It's creating this massive issue. The biggest problem that I think Imperial County is currently facing is that a lack of locally trained nurses and public health practitioners. They are paying traveling nurses, 3 times the rate of their local nurses, and it's causing the collapse of the healthcare system. It's a critical problem. So I don't think the lithium workforce is necessarily separate, but I do think, if we're looking at the tax that was put on the extraction, 20% going to Salton Sea mediation work, very helpful. I think the Better World Group just put out an analysis on broadband and a few other things that are happening up in the north end of the Salton Sea. That analysis is helpful in understanding how our community is going to develop up here in response to the lithium opportunity. But lithium jobs are great and the topic of this discussion, but we need to be investing in healthcare, also nurses, public health researchers, all of those things. It's not one or the other, because they're so tied in Imperial County. Health, we have to have a functioning healthcare system to have a functioning economy. And right now that is sort of not the case in Imperial County.
Thank you, John. We have another question. Patrick Dobson from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. How do you envision the new lithium tax being used to benefit the local community and its infrastructure and providing equity in lithium development? Chris, would you like to take this one?
Well, I can start, but I also would like to hear what John would say about it. Well, as John said, 20% of the lithium excise tax will go towards the Salton Sea region and rehabilitation there, and 80% for Imperial County to invest. the county is going to need to invest in some infrastructure if it's going to be possible to, extract the lithium, roads, bridges, and others. And I think there's a real question of how much assistance the county can get from the federal government and the state government for that. I think there's some expectation that there might be some need to continue to invest in infrastructure even once the lithium is starting to be extracted. But I think then it comes back to a question of, what does it take to help recognize growing other industries in the region? The region's dominated by agriculture. Those are primarily low-wage jobs. How can you get technological innovations in agriculture that can help improve productivity and help raise wages, while also having significant workforce systems development training programs that can help move people who might be displaced by those increasing productivity into other new jobs. Healthcare is a major employment sector in the county, and that's a very bifurcated industry. There are some very well-paying jobs in that industry, and then some very low-paying jobs in those industries. So how do you invest in upskilling and uptraining to help improve the quality of those jobs? But I think it comes back to then really looking at the county's comprehensive economic development strategy, and with this new revenue coming in, what are the ways of investing in that? And the thing that I would point to again is, collaborating across boundaries. It is often really hard for Imperial County and Eastern Coachella Valley, or the eastern part of Riverside County, to collaborate, despite the fact that their economies are very similar, the demographics of the population are very similar, and they're both dealing with these issues of the challenge of the Salton Sea and the lowering water levels and toxic dust in the playas that are there. And there are efforts underway to really bring together leading officials from both counties to actually discuss equitable development strategies across the region. There was a proposal that came out of the Blue Ribbon Commission on Lithium Extraction to actually create an economic development zone that would include really the whole kind of southeast corner of California, kind of crossing those county boundaries, but what I think is a more reasonable kind of economic region for the area. That the creation of that kind of zone would then make it eligible to apply for federal funding and state funding as that region. There were efforts in the state legislature this year to get that acknowledged. That didn't go far enough, but I think it's something that's really worth considering.
Thank you, Chris. John, do you want to jump in on that as well?
Yeah, the only other piece that I would mention, I think Chris did a wonderful job, and certainly there's playa dust issues in Eastern Coachella Valley as well. The one piece about the tax and the impact, because it's a production-based tax, they're not going to see the full benefit of that until 2035, right? That's when the full build out of the 3 known developers today on the sites that they have, wells dug. So we're talking 11 years from now, right? It's going to be a trickle at first, and then it will eventually get better. And so this idea that this will be an overnight lifesaver for the county is not a reality, which is why why we want to work with the county on things like the tech hub, and what can we do now to start bringing in dollars, so that way we're not just waiting, right? How can we be more proactive in collaborating to bring additional dollars into the region?
Thank you. We have another question. Elizabeth Bentoncourt from California Department of Conservation asks, how are supply chains considered in the carbon intensity score? And is mining an activity that increases the CI of batteries? Alissa, would you like to take this one?
Sure thing, Melissa. So the answer is yes. Mining and every step along the supply chain and the life cycle will contribute to the carbon intensity of a battery. However, from a carbon intensity standpoint, mining is very small. So when we think about the goals of deploying EVs, a lot of those goals are about mitigating climate change, and that means reducing carbon dioxide emissions along with other greenhouse gases. So thinking about how carbon intensive our technologies are for achieving that is really important. We don't want to invest in a technology where the life cycle emissions are really high and then we don't really deliver on the benefits. The thing is that first of all, electric vehicles do deliver emissions reductions, meaning we do reduce the impact of our car travel by quite a lot here in California. But in terms of carbon intensity, the mining is not really a big contributor to the impacts of that vehicle. The biggest impacts are going to be in terms of vehicle manufacturing, all the other things that go into a vehicle. There's a lot more steel going into a vehicle than battery, for example, or lithium, as well as the manufacturing process for batteries, which can be quite electricity intensive. And then the electricity used to manufacture and operate the vehicle is going to be crucial for carbon intensity. All of those things are more important than mining. As a caveat, though, like the work that I do, we never just look at carbon intensity. We have to look at other environmental impacts. So the impacts of mining may be low carbon, but they can be pretty horrific, whether it's toxic tailings, it's the pollution of groundwater, it's disturbance of ecosystems. In many cases, you can have workers in very unsafe working conditions and directly affect them, whether it's for respiratory effects or actually accident rates and other kinds of exposures. So the answer is mining doesn't contribute a lot to carbon intensity, but it does contribute to other kinds of environmental impacts we should care about in the supply chains that we're accessing.
If I can quickly add maybe on the technology side, and Alissa is exactly right? There are the two big ones where there's a lot of carbon intensity is, like she was mentioning, at least on the battery side, is the battery manufacturing. It turns out there is a particular step where you have to heat up these dry rooms. You got to do these things in a sort of a low moisture environment, and that requires us to kind of remove moisture from these dry room beds, and that can be a huge issue. There's a drying step that takes place in order to make the electrode. That can be a huge issue also. There are things going on. You might have heard about things called dry processing. There are ways in which you can sort of eliminate some of those steps, which can reduce the amount of carbon use, amount of electricity use. Obviously, there is things that are happening upstream of that also that have to be thought about carefully. The way we make the battery materials involves a lot of energy. Obviously, we can try to get that heat. So in order to make the battery, you need high temperatures. Heat is very difficult to get from electricity, so we tend to burn fossil fuels. But if you can find a way to decrease the temperature at which we make those materials, then presumably we can start to use renewable generation of electricity, and then using sort of heat from the electricity in order to kind of get to those temperatures. So there are things that are going on that can go in the direction also. But certainly, I think the point is well made, right? I mean, it's not just about the carbon emissions. We have to think about other aspects of the sort of environmental impacts, I think, beyond just the carbon when it comes to sort of the mining side of things.
Thank you, Alissa, and thank you, Venkat. Julia Turner writes in, Julia Turner, procurement manager at Energy Source Minerals, writes in, with mining and direct lithium extraction technologies in the US, and before we can fully recycle lithium, how long before the US could be self-sustaining without importing lithium from other countries? Venkat, can you take this one?
I'll start with a crack, but others might be more suited for this, right? So just the reality of how long it takes to do things in this industry. Typically, I think John mentioned this, we've heard about permitting taking a decade, right? So it's first of all not obvious that we could just start something up new for lithium extraction and ultimately get it to the market anytime soon. Any new large facility takes many years before it reaches up to the point where one can have, I think, cost-effective ways of pulling it together. So, and recycling is going to take a long time. I think Alissa mentioned 2040 before we can start to kind of fully get to be a point where we have a circular economy, just because we just don't have enough lithium in these electric cars right now, because there are not enough electric cars, and they do last 15 years, and we want them to last 15 years if we want to, right? So reality, we may be a decade away before we're able to kind of get to these mining and DLE technologies to a state where we are saying there is enough for us to not kind of think about alternates to kind of getting it from other countries. I will say that demand is kind of the complication here, right? I mean, we all used to have demand curves that looked really promising. You would have seen news articles in the last month saying that EV demand is decreasing, that there is a sort of a trend, or if it's a one-off thing, we don't quite know. So we'll have to see how that all matches up. But typically, these things don't happen overnight. Everything is a decadal process, I think, when it comes to manufacturing, especially in the scales that we're talking about here.
And if I can hop in on the demand side, I think one thing to think about is we're talking about supplying minerals, but like Venkat said, we don't know how much we need in the future, and we have so many levers we can pull to change how much we need. And those levers include how many cars we need, how big the batteries are going to be in those cars, and all the things, and actually technological change as well. And then all of the factors that influence how big the battery has to be and how many cars we need, which have to do with lots of other things that we might want to do, like improve alternatives to car-based travel, or to discourage like the supersizing of batteries, which has an enormous impact on how much lithium the US needs. We currently have the biggest batteries in the world on average by at least 20 kilowatt hours compared to like most of Europe. And it's just, they're much bigger. So do we need these huge batteries, or can we design vehicles differently, or design charging infrastructure in such a way that we don't feel like we need these enormous batteries? So lots of levers there that we might want to like think about moving around to change what the demand looks like, and then we can get to self-sufficiency quicker.
Well, if I can just
sorry, go ahead, Chris. Go ahead.
I was just going to say one other point related to the question is that, for the foreseeable future, and I think appropriately, we're going to be dependent on global trade. And, if we're talking about electric vehicles, that's a globally integrated industry, and I think always will be. And, we've mentioned you need, steel, aluminum, copper, materials that currently come from all over the world. And so I think the questions we should be asking ourselves is, how do we ensure, the resources that we're getting are being done in as environmentally friendly and human rights and labor appropriate way as possible? How are we ensuring the kind of, life cycle tracing that we've talked about here, and that we can see that globally? And that's going to require working with the European Union. That's going to require, working with China. And trying to make those supply chains more transparent and accountable on a global scale, not just the US, at the same time as we're trying to build out our own domestic industry, because I do think there is a value of building that out here domestically, both in terms of economic reliability and because of the economic opportunity that's part of that.
Can I just provide one additional point? I think everybody's really covered sort of the established supply chains and manufacturing and mining infrastructure. One thing California is very good at is innovation and supporting early stage startups in the battery space, the battery supply space, component manufacturing, whatever it is. The CEC program through CalSeed or through EPIC or through their Cal Testbed. Like we've noted at least 48 companies that are doing some part of this ecosystem, across the state. Like there's innovation happening here. The challenge is how do we get from like innovation to impact, and that process, especially in the battery manufacturing space, because each cell has such slim profit margins that this one thing could make it, unprofitable or not profitable. And so I think understanding what California is very good at is innovation, but what we have lost a lot of lately is manufacturing. And so how do we bring back those like sort of middle market good jobs to lean into that innovation, but also by doing the thing that we're innovating also, which is something that we are currently lacking in.
Maybe I'll just finish off. Actually, great points, maybe to the point that both Alissa and John just made, right? So there is a kind of a movement in the industry or the whole, I guess, battery community to think about sodium-based batteries instead of lithium. Everything is 10 years away. I should just start by saying that nothing happens overnight. But hopefully what will happen is, as we look at all the different places where we want to use batteries, right? Different parts of the grid, behind the meter, and big installations, long duration storage, electric cars, we are going to see, I think, a diversity of materials, many using lithium, but some not using lithium. That's going to help us ease out of that. Obviously, that means we have to think about the supply chain for all those new materials that we're talking about, ensure that we're doing that responsibly. But I think there's an opportunity for us to kind of think about that next generation so that we're able to get to the sustainable future. The second point I wanted to quickly make, which actually reminded me from the point Alissa made, right? The consumer market for EVs is diversifying. We've seen this happen to some extent because people are buying lower range EVs that use lithium iron phosphate instead of these longer range EVs that are more expensive, because families are deciding that they kind of understand a bit more about how their commutes are going to look like. But the change has to be dramatic, to the point Alissa made, right? It can't be just, I want to buy a 250-mile EV instead of a 350-mile EV. It has to be recognizing that I may only need a 100-mile EV because I only go 30 miles a day, right? So I think a lot of education and a lot of sort of incentivizing people to kind of think about what is it that they want could be important. Fast charging is a killer app, right? If you're able to get fast charging 5 minutes, then it changes the whole dynamic. There are technologies that hopefully come into play in the next 5 years that allow that kind of fast charging, that could be a game changer in terms of getting people to not worry so much about range anxiety and kind of minimize the amount of lithium we use in these cells, just because she's absolutely right. We have way too big batteries, much bigger than what we actually need.
Thank you. I'm going to open this next question up to the panel. This comes from Valerie Carranza, California Air Resource Board. How is the lithium industry planning to partner and consult with indigenous communities to address environmental and public health issues and prevent the destruction of important culture sites? I've opened it up to whoever. There you go.
Sure.
I was looking at you, John. I'll say a few things, but you go first.
So we work with the Southern California Tribal Chairmen's Association. They are very engaged in understanding how the tribes can have opportunity to access this kind of economic change for many different tribes in the region. And so, we've worked with them on, they have an NSF ARIA Regional Innovation Engine Planning grant that they're focused specifically on, developing components of the battery ecosystem on tribal land, while obviously being, aware of their own, preserved sites, historical sites, culturally significant sites. They can control that development. I do think that there's the California Tribal Business Alliance, which is also engaging in this process pretty frequently now. And so you're seeing tribes engage. The challenge, I think, and this is something that's not talked about enough, is that non-federally recognized tribes tend to be in more dispersed locations. They're often not as located next to major transportation corridors. That way they can't participate in the same way. I think understanding how they are going to engage is almost a different question than how are the federally recognized tribes going to engage, because they're living in totally different realities in terms of access to economic opportunity.
Thank you, John. Okay, we've come down to our last question. So let's make this a bit of a lightning round. What recommendations would each of you have for policymakers in California when it comes to building and supporting a lithium battery supply chain?
Well, I'll start it off, but I'm sure we've all got things to say. So one is investing in high road workforce development. The state, through the Labor and Workforce Development Agency, has a whole program on supporting high road training partnerships and focusing first on the lithium extraction side. I think it's really important to ensure that those jobs that are in the operations of the lithium facilities, once they get up and running, are good jobs, and that really ensures worker voice, ideally unionization, or at least employer neutrality on whether workers want to unionize or not, and making sure you're investing training linked with good jobs and wages around that. I think policies that emphasize the investing in locally serving infrastructure, not just the infrastructure that's going to allow for extraction, is really important. I think John's point earlier about how do we, I loved your phrasing, moving from innovation to impact. How do we ensure that all the innovative companies that we're, supporting through the California Energy Commission and various other, public subsidies in California, stay in California, manufacture in California, can help build out in California? How do we help ensure that happens? People have mentioned addressing the permitting barriers for manufacturing. I think that's really important. That can be done through things like the programmatic environmental impact review process that's going on at the moment, where you essentially pre-approve for a whole series of uses. So then once you get to an actual use type, it can be accelerated. Imperial County has the Mesquite Lake Industrial Development Zone, which is the place where State Volt is hoping to build out their battery manufacturing facility in Imperial County. That has a lot of streamlined permitting as part of that. It's part of what made Nevada successful, is the Tahoe Reno Industrial Center is really streamlining that permitting. So those are like pretty high level. I think the transparency initiatives we've talked about are all really important. The specifics have to be worked out, but yeah, I think the levers are there.
Thanks, Chris. I want to give everybody a chance too, so let's jump over to Venkat.
I don't do policy, so I should be a little careful. Maybe I'll, and national labs particularly don't want to give policy recommendations. So maybe I'll just say that I think California has a huge advantage, right? John mentioned the sort of the innovation that happens there, the small companies. We've already talked about the importance of having these kinds of regional ecosystems that can become a spurring point where others want to relocate. I think anything the state can do to sort of incentivize others to locate to that region can create a huge, I think, benefit, both in terms of not shipping things across the country and not doing things which involve low labor laws, and lots of things that can happen if I think there are incentives provided and policies in place to ensure that there's some sort of an ecosystem developing in that region where you're seeing that benefit of kind of the localization of, I think, the battery industry. So we've seen this happen in Canada, right? I mean, there are places where these kinds of ecosystems develop and companies start to come and co-locate. I think thinking about incentives to do that can be a huge benefit for the state.
Thanks, Venkat. I'm going to jump to Alissa and then we'll go to John.
Thanks, Melissa. Well, I've thought more about sort of the end of life of batteries than I have about the making of batteries. But what I will say is I think we should, as a state, we have different powers than as a federal government. But if we look to places like Europe, where they've done a really good job of holistically thinking about making, using, and disposing of the battery together, we have additional opportunities in California. We have 50% of all the EVs on the road. Will continue to be a huge early adopter of EVs. So the batteries are here. So we should be also focused on thinking about developing a robust repurposing industry, remanufacturing industry. All of those are pretty labor intensive and maybe less environmentally intensive than mining and manufacturing in some cases. So we have a lot of other things we could think about as well as recycling, of course. So I think if we think about the whole life cycle together as an opportunity to grow jobs and grow industry here in California, that will get more value for the environmental intensity of the operations.
Great, thanks, Alissa. Thanks, Melissa. So just, I mean, what everybody has said here already, that let's do all of those things. But I think if there was three things that I would really highlight is to continue to invest in innovation. Like, we have to be a leader in innovation in order for our economy to continue to grow and continue to do things in the right way, right? Environmentally responsible, socially responsible, invest in innovation, continue to invest in workforce development opportunities in regions that have been historically marginalized or underinvested in, because their communities have been, at the front of the economic and social and environmental impacts of those investments. How do we ensure that they can come along with us? And so being written into solicitations that said you must engage with communities that are in Cal EPA, whatever that looks like. And then the third piece is really ensuring that we bring back some manufacturing base. Yes, we have manufacturing here, but I think the scale at which this new lithium opportunity presents, if we can capitalize on that, it takes many years of permitting planning, so we need to start those things now. Again, I think we want to make sure that people are innovating, are also staying here, because once they leave, they rarely come back, as Venkat has pointed out with his trip to Illinois. So that's what I've got.
Thank you. We have come to the end of our time, and I would like to thank the panel for the great conversation. And now I will hand it back to Sarah to close.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you to all of our panelists today for sharing your expertise. I really appreciated the breadth we covered today. Workforce, technology, health, equity, community engagement. I mean, you really hit on it all. So thank you. Thank you to everybody who attended today. If you would like to watch this briefing again, or you have a colleague who was interested but couldn't make it, we will post the recording on our website along with the one-pager and the contact information of all the experts that you heard from today. Finally, I want to quickly share that CCST has a really exciting opportunity for current California grad students, postdocs, and early career researchers to present their research at the California State Capitol as part of our Science Translator Showcase. The applications close tomorrow, so we'll drop the link in the chat, and please help us spread the word. Thank you all so much. Have a really good day.